Are they about to witness the greatest success or the greatest disaster of modern Formula One? Ferrari has just done something he had ever done, change everything for a single pilot, and it is not anyone. It's Lewis Hamilton. In Maranello, in a meeting as confidential as historical, Ferrari sealed an unprecedented play, designing his 2026 car, the so-called 678 project, around Lewis Hamilton's unique pilot style. This is not a light adaptation, nor a symbolic concession. It is a structural revolution that cuts with more than a decade of evolution centered on Charles Leclerc, the alleged heir of Ferrari, to put all the resources and ambitions in the hands of a man who will then have 41 years. Ferrari has made a decision that goes far beyond a simple sports strategy. In an era dominated by simulators, data, and mathematical precision, what happened in that closed room of Maranello was a declaration of principles. The 2026 car will not be designed to adapt to a duo of pilots, nor will it be built as a logical evolution of the previous years. Instead, Ferrari has broken with his technical tradition to start from scratch, taking as a starting point the wind tunnel, but to a human being, a pilot, Lewis Hamilton. These types of decisions are seen once each generation. It is not just about adapting certain ergonomic elements or balancing the car for two different styles. What Ferrari is doing is redefining each parameter from chassis architecture, mass distribution, suspension geometry, to aerodynamic load philosophy depending on how Hamilton feels the car. Instead of looking for a good car, they are building a car that is excellent only if you pilot as Lewis does. And that has deep consequences, both in the technical and political level. Because this move implies, without saying it explicitly, that Charles Leclerc is no longer the pilot on which the future is built. After years being Ferrari's great promise, the team's development axis, the young Monegasco is relegated to a secondary position. His pilot preferences, his technical feedback, his strengths in medium curve and initial traction have ceased to be the priority. And even if this is not said publicly, the change in the internal dynamics of the team is as radical as the car's technical redesign. This Ferrari total turn to Hamilton also represents a change in power management. In previous years, decisions were so blocked by the engineering departments or by the technical directorate of the Scuderia. But now, with a more centralized leadership and total support from the highest executive levels, the commitment to the British is not only sports, it is institutional. Ferrari not only wants to win, he wants to do it through Hamilton. And that completely changes the tone of what its arrival represents to the team. In addition, this total commitment to Hamilton implies unprecedented pressure. If the 678 project does not yield to the expected level, the failure will not be technical, it will be personal. The car cannot hide behind a shared approach or a lack of alignment between pilots. It will be the Hamilton machine, built in its image and likeness, and that makes it the most responsible not only of success, but also of any disappointment. Therefore, this decision is both glorious and dangerous. Either he gives Ferrari his first title in 2 decades, or finally buries an era that was born with promises impossible to sustain. The 2025 season has been a brutal training field for Hamilton. Accustomed to the surgical precision of the Mercedes, it has had to relearn what it means to drive a car, starting with braking. Throughout his career, Hamilton had perfected a driving style that was built around stability, predictability, and an almost intuitive connection with the car. For more than a decade in Mercedes, its way of braking, attacking the curves, and modular the accelerator was completely aligned with the characteristics of a car that developed in symbiosis with its piloting. That symbiotic relationship ended as soon as he sat for the first time on SF25. The Ferrari motor braking system, much more aggressive than Mercedes, represented an invisible but decisive barrier. In Mercedes, Lewis barely used that technology. It was a secondary tool, barely noticeable, that did not condition its attack style. But in Ferrari, the system acts with a direct intrusion that generates electricity for the battery more intensely, altering the way the car decelerates and transfers the weight. For a pilot like Hamilton, who relies on the precision of the braking point as axis of his performance, that difference is devastating. Each curve becomes a new lesson. It's not just about tightening the pedal a few meters before or after. It is a mental reprogramming. The car reacts differently. Mass transfers, aerodynamic load in braking, the transition between brake and accelerator, everything has a different cadence. And to top it off, that feeling is aggravated with the Brembo brakes that Ferrari uses, very different from the carbon industries that Hamilton handled his entire career. The initial bite, the optimal working temperature, thermal fatigue, every detail adds uncertainty to its piloting. This technical challenge has exposed it to vulnerabilities that it had not shown since its early years. And that is where psychological pressure is amplified. Each training, each qualifying session, each feedback with engineers has become an exam. The Italian press, relentless by tradition, does not take breath. And within the team, there are eyes that constantly compare their performance with that of Leclerc, who, despite everything, knows the secrets of the car more naturally. But the hardest thing has not been technical. It has been emotional. The Hamilton that arrived in Ferrari loaded with the ambition of an 8th crown, to become a living legend of the rampant Cavallino. But that ambition has crashed into a much more rough reality. Ferrari is not Mercedes. Neither in structure, nor in methodology, nor in management. And for someone who came from an environment where the minimum detail was optimized with obsession, finding a more traditional culture has been like landing on another planet. The SF-25 ceased to look like a disobedient machine, and for a moment, it was an extension of its reflexes. It showed in his body language, in the way he was looking for pianos without fear, how he placed the car in the high-speed sectors. That return was not a coincidence, but the product of weeks of silent work. Of private sessions in simulator, of tense meetings with engineers, of tests that did not go well but continued accumulating information. It was the fruit of obsession. This performance did not go unnoticed in Maranello. In fact, it was the turning point that accelerated the most delicate decisions at a technical and strategic level. The internal documents that Hamilton had sent with radical suggestions on the 2026 car were no longer seen as desires for a capricious veteran. They transformed into instructions from someone who, even with 40 years, can redefine the level of competitiveness of a historical team. From his vision on the position of the seat for a better weight transfer, to settings in the rear axle geometry to improve traction at the curve output, each suggestion was taken with a new degree of seriousness. Not as one more pilot, but as the central axis of Project 678. The most disruptive is that Ferrari has accepted that premise. That the future of the team is not necessarily linked to a young generation or a progressive evolution process. They have opted for the boldest route, betting that experience, competitive intelligence and Hamilton's adaptation capacity can produce a winning platform in 2026. And this new approach has already generated shock waves inside the paddock. Because if Ferrari is willing to build from scratch for a veteran pilot, the rest of the grille cannot continue to operate in a balanced key. This is a declaration of technical and philosophical war. Ferrari does not want to compete. He wants to dominate. And he wants to do it with Hamilton as an architect and executor. What remains to see is whether that return in China was the beginning of a new cycle, or an isolated flash in the middle of a storm. But if something has become clear, it is that Hamilton has not yet said his last word. Not as a pilot, not as a legend, and much less like the man who wants to rewrite the story of Ferrari from the very core of his DNA. What Ferrari is doing is not precedence. It is a story that challenges sports logic, but it is also a testimony of blind faith in the greatness of a pilot. Is this what finally returns Ferrari to the top, or are we seeing the beginning of the end of a legend? Formula One has witnessed innumerable technical bets, risky signings and aerodynamic revolutions, but what is happening in Ferrari with Lewis Hamilton exceeds all known limits. It is not just an ambitious play, it is a declaration of intentions that touches the deepest pillars of motoring. For the first time in the modern era, a historical team decides to abandon any notion of internal balance to erect its future around a single pilot. And not any pilot, but one who arrives at 40 years facing the ghosts of time, the pressure of the criticism and the weight of his own legacy. These types of decisions mark an era. Because it is not only performance but ideology. Ferrari is making it clear that talent can still be above the algorithm, that the instinct of a champion can dictate the course of an entire factory. And although this vision sounds epic, it is also dangerous. Because if the 2026 car does not yield, if the 678 project fails, there will be no excuses. There will be no space to point to the wind tunnel, strategy or tires. The failure will have names and surnames. And that leaves us with the great unknown. What happens if it works? What happens if Ferrari, under the technical guide of Hamilton, builds the best grid car? If this radical change not only returns it to the podium, but it crowns it champion for the 8th time? We would be faced with the most spectacular sports redemption in decades. The perfect closure for a legendary race. But it would also be the beginning of a new stage for Ferrari, one that would leave behind its traditionalist vision to adopt a pilot-centered approach as an absolute nucleus. This is where you, as a fan, do you think Ferrari has done well to break his balance to bet everything to Lewis Hamilton? Or do you think this is a desperate maneuver that can cost a development generation? Leave me your opinion in the comments.